Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle. I'm so glad you've joined us. I do know that you're a consumer of electricity because you couldn't be watching this program without electricity, and like me and like everybody else in the country practically, and for that matter, all of the developed world, we take electricity tremendously for granted. We also take its elasticity for granted. When we want it, it's there. You can do the most extraordinary things. You can drive from the Florida Keys to Alaska and never ask, but plug in your appliances and they'll work. You may have to make adjustments for banking and for other local considerations, but electricity will be a standard, available, on-demand commodity for your use at surprisingly low cost. People don't like to talk about it or even think about it because depending on whether you use more air conditioning or more heating, there are times of the year when your bill gets seemingly very large. But you do have some control of it. You may not think you do. The thing about electricity is it's moved way from being a luxury, probably around the turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th century actually, into the 20th century when it was a luxury, to today where it is a necessity and nothing we do would function without it. But it is not going to remain the same because disruptive technology is coming along, and it's coming along surprisingly fast. Leon Trotsky said, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." Well, I say, you may not be interested in disruptive technology, but disruptive technology is interested in you. And that applies to this basic commodity, this essential of the civilized world, electricity. To discuss the impact of disruption, disruptive technology, and the opportunities that it presents for the electric industry and what you will have to pay for and how much the disruption will affect your own well-being, I have two remarkably well-informed people with me today here on White House Chronicle. And I might say that the government, in all of its manifestations, but particularly the political class, seems to be remarkably shielded from this changing world of electricity. Anyway, I have with me Brian Keane, who's the president of SmartPower, which is a progressive solar power enthusiast, renewable fuels of all kind. Yep. And I'm very glad to have with us from National Grid, Edward White, who's the Vice President of Customer Strategy and Environmental Matters at National Grid, which is the primary supplier of electricity in New England, or right up there.
Yep, one of the biggest, yep.
One of the biggest. Welcome to the broadcast, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
Brian, yes. What are you doing to our electric system, and why are you doing it, and are you going to desist?
Well, no, here's what I think is happening. I think it's a very exciting time in energy. And kind of what we start with the fact is that all of us are using energy, but we're all using more energy than we've ever used before. We are literally using energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days.
Are you talking about electricity or all energy?
Well, electricity for sure, and then all energy. But think of the fact, when you're asleep, your house is still on. When you're asleep, you're using energy. We're here at the studio, but our flat screen TVs are still drawing power, even though we've turned them off. So because of the way we have, because we live today, we just keep using more and more energy. What that means is
these are the vampire devices.
Just as starters, right? Yeah. But what we need to do is be more creative about how we use, how we get our energy, and then ultimately be more responsible in how we use it. And so what we're seeing today, and we're seeing this across New England, we're seeing across the country, is people driving towards new sources of energy, whether it's wind or specifically residential solar. We're seeing how they're saving energy in much more creative and engaging ways. And that they're doing it not to live in cold, dark houses, but just to be smarter.
Ed, this saving that Brian has talked about so eloquently, this is largely a cultural movement, isn't it? It's not just a practical saving energy. It's not economically driven that much, is it? Isn't it the middle class and the upper middle class concerned about global warming, concerned about what's happening to the planet, rather than being concerned about the cost of energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is it started out very much policy driven, as you say, but I couldn't agree more with your opening. Energy is becoming more and more exciting to all of our customers of all economic classes, and so what we're seeing is an energy efficiency is a great opportunity for customers with big houses, small houses, apartments, and we've been offering energy efficiency programs, not just National Grid, but within the Northeast and also across the country to help customers be more informed around energy. And so I would agree with Brian, it is an exciting time.
Isn't the first step in this was the smart grid, is that so? About people being more informed?
Yes and no. I think what we're finding is as customers are using energy 24/7, as Brian was saying, they're wanting to know more about their energy use. And so Smart Grid gives you visibility or transparency into that usage. So whether you put solar on your roof, whether you have an electric vehicle, or whether you just want a smart thermostat that you can control with an app. I oftentimes joke with my friends, when was the last time in the last decade that you actually talked about your thermostat? Right. But now when you watch the NFL, there's commercials for the Nest thermostat or the Lyric thermostat.
Yet the Washington Post, in a blog on electricity and on the smart grid, said that consumer indifference was something that the utility industry had not expected. They had expected there'd be a lot more enthusiastic embracing. People have them. I think there are 50 million meters installed across the country, but it hasn't become a great issue.
Well, I think what you're seeing, there's some utilities like National Grid specifically who are making real efforts to speak to their customers. And they're actually, so what's happening, at the same time the American consumer is saying, hey, we want energy choice, we want to do some cool things. There are certain utilities across the country that are saying, you know what? You're right, and you actually could all be part of the solution too. And what National Grid and these utilities are interested in is not simply a climate change solution, but an energy solution. The biggest, most expensive thing they could do is actually have to buy more energy. So the less energy we use on every day, every hour, every week, every day, really does count. And so that's where the utilities are now really engaging with their customers, and their customers are saying, thank you. I'd like to actually learn to save more.
The head of Électricité de France, the big national French utility, was just in Washington to talk about the problems that they're having with solar power taking some of their most important load. And one of the things they did say, Brian, was they are going to have to be much closer to their customers in the future.
Absolutely.
And solar is having very destabilizing effects in parts of Europe. Germany, which has a huge solar commitment and has renounced nuclear, has caused a lot of problems for its neighbors because suddenly it comes on the European grid and says, there's no sunshine today, we want your electrons. That's what we see here. Let's talk about net metering, which is not understood by people. As I understand it, it's if you have a self-generator, primarily a solar unit on top of your house, and it makes more electricity than you use, you are by law allowed to sell it back to the utility, and there's the rub.
No. Well, I would say, yeah, not sure it's a rub. So I think it's an interesting...
Well, an awful lot of people in the utility industry think it's a tremendous rub.
And it's been a very interesting policy that's helped kind of goose the solar system, right. the solar market. But, quite frankly, what we're seeing in solar is not a demand for more policies, just a demand for solar. And take North Smithfield, Rhode Island. A little town in Rhode Island had one solar installation in the entire town. We came in and did an 8-week solar campaign.
We as
my organization, SmartPower. In 8 weeks, 84 residents signed up for solar. So, and by the way, they're not saying, oh, I want my net metering. They're simply saying,
why are they doing this?
Because, it's a consumer demand. And all of a sudden, what's happening?
But what is driving the consumer
industry has
demand?
figured out.
What do they want? Is it a morally superior thing?
Nope. The industry has figured out what General Motors figured out a long time ago. You don't get rich selling cars. You get rich financing cars. Now we have financing for solar. So it's $0 down, $100 a month. And so there's a lot of people who would say, well, I'll do that.
What does this do to what's left of the grid? Around New England, for example, and you're from New England, you still have a lot of tenement houses. They are not going to get solar panels. Isn't the cost of traditional electricity going to go up because the mansions are making their own electricity?
So I would say early in the chapter of the book, absolutely, that was probably the concern in the case. what we're seeing is the cost of solar coming down dramatically, and now you're seeing an evolution to go from the policy drivers, which drove a lot of the early installations, to now figuring out the right business model. So is net metering the way forward in the future, or is there a different way to compensate those that are generating?
Tell me a little more about net metering. I have a solar, and when there's no sun, I buy from the grid, yep. And I pay, what, say 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Then when I have an excess and the sun is blazing, I sell back to the grid. How much do I get for my electricity?
So in New England, it's 20 cents.
So there's it's a wash.
It's the retail rate. It's the all-in bundled rate.
Is that a viable thing for the utility?
It's something that's caused concern, and I think I, for one, am probably not your standard utility person who would think that that's a negative. I happen to have solar on my roof. I'm a net metered customer with my local utility. I did it. You asked the question, why did I do it? I did it for price stability reasons. Mm-hmm. I know what my investment was for the solar on my roof. I know what it's capable of generating on average for a year. And I know that I may generate a little bit more or generate a little bit less. With this harsh winter and the snow covering my solar panels, they're not very helpful today, but this summer they were very helpful. And I think really what it gets down to and what excites National Grid to be part of this discussion and discussions like this is we're on the cutting edge of actually getting it right, transitioning from policy to the right business models so that all of our consumers can benefit from this exciting evolution in energy.
Brian, to what extent is solar subsidized?
Well, you know, it's not to the extent that the other energy sources are.
No, but just tell us how much subsidy there is.
Well, so there's a federal tax credit, and then it's a mishmash of policies across the country. So every state, some states have different policies, some don't. The president's budget that he just introduced actually suggests that he would put in the tax credit permanently. With or without a tax credit, what we're seeing...
Which is a kind of...
Oh, which would be a subsidy, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, and which is a kind of social engineering. This is the federal government saying it is desirable to make electricity.
Well, and the federal government did that. It continues to do that with oil. It continues to do that with coal.
I'm not arguing that. We're just talking about solar.
It's actually energy engineering is what it is, because the government has always done that. We have always propped up our energy sources because we understand that if we have energy, we can do all these things. So it becomes very important for the government to actually have a stake in energy. But that said, what we're seeing is that people aren't saying, oh, I'm going to buy it because there's a tax credit. What we're actually seeing is actually people are buying it because they've kind of wanted it forever. They've said, I've always kind of wanted it. I just don't know how to get it.
An average home, a comfortable home, say 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, garage, you know, your suburban home. How much does it cost to put a solar installation on that?
Well, so the 2 things that go into the cost. One is the hardware itself, kind of the panels themselves, and then what they call the soft cost, the actual getting that panel put on your roof. Hardware costs are coming way down because there's been imports from Japan and China. And increasingly, soft costs are coming down through programs we do, like Solarize, which actually is a group purchasing program, and actually allows local installers to then install multiple houses at the same time.
Does that become a microgrid?
No.
They're not linked to each other?
No, they're all connected to their utility, and so they have power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But solar is paying perhaps almost a half of the cost of their house in some cases. And so what they're able to do is actually simply use it as a hedge on increased prices or making sure that...
What is the issue with the quality of the roof on which you put the solar?
So very important, you know, when you get a car and they say are you going to garage your car because then your insurance goes down? And that's because they want to protect the car. It's very important that your roof is a solid roof. And so if you have a solar system on your roof for the next 20 years, you want to make sure that roof is going to be there. So if your roof is 20 years old, a solar installer is probably going to say, you know what, as soon as you get that roof done, I'll put on the solar. But so there's a lot that goes into it. And let's make no mistake, in New England specifically, 80% of the people who want solar cannot get solar. So this isn't a 100% game we're playing. This is simply opening a marketplace to really 20% of the market who want it. And so it's disruptive technology that has been coming along. You know, they'll say this will be an overnight success that's been taking 40 years to get here. but it'll be really disruptive when we actually start talking about batteries.
It's interesting you say 40 years, because in energy it takes about 40 years for every technology. Yeah. It took 40 years for fracking to get here.
That's right.
I'm going to take a little break for station identification, primarily for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, channel 124, the POTUS channel. Also, I'd like to tell everybody that you are listening to White House Chronicle with myself, Llewellyn King, with Brian Keane, president of SmartPower, very progressive, not-for-profit, but very much into these things, and of course Edward White, vice president for customer strategy and environmental at National Grid, one of our big investor-owned utilities. And that brings me to the subject of what's going to happen to all the small utilities. If I understand it correctly, there are about 80% of our electricity comes from investor-owned utilities, for-profit companies like yours. But there are 2,000 other utilities, some of which are just cover a few blocks of a city, and many of which are municipals. The big ones everybody knows about, TVA, these are the big public power, but there are all these other small ones. How is this disruptive technology going to affect them? They have less option for hedging, don't they, between their supplies and their obligations?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. One of the things that I've learned from some of our smaller utilities that we interact with is they're a lot more nimble. They can get a lot more done at a much local level. And it's actually taken utilities like National Grid to sort of reassess ourselves and make sure that we don't think of ourselves as the big utility. We're very much a local utility. We're physically connected to each and every one of our customers, and that's one of the things that excites us. So, you know, where the market goes from here, hard for me to speculate, but what I would say is utilities, both big and small, are now not only looking at this disruptive technology, as you describe it, as a threat, but also as an opportunity, because the policy-driven component of a lot of this disruptive technology had it going everywhere and anywhere, wherever land was cheap, wherever wherever they could install it. Whereas now the key to all of this is going to be, how do you integrate it? How do you make a smarter grid? How do you use this energy when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing? What do you do at nighttime? And I think battery technology, as has been alluded to, will be a game changer.
Batteries was the subject that I was going to get to.
Sorry.
That's quite all right. I'm so glad you're ahead of me. Batteries are getting better. You have people like Elon Musk, Tesla, who is building batteries and who says, and incidentally is working to some extent with the Edison Electric Institute, I was told recently, that you're going to be able to plug your car in to deal with the time when the sun's not shining, so that you have 24-hour self-sufficiency in electricity, or you can actually buy a battery that is much better than batteries out to this point in time. These rely on the lithium-ion batteries rather than our old lead acids in our cars, and suddenly we don't need the utility. Bye-bye, au revoir, or not au revoir, just goodbye. What happens then? How do you deal with that load that you've lost? And who is going to pay for all those lines and poles and transformers and things that make up the electric grid?
Right, and so the good news is that will not happen overnight. It'll happen much quicker than I think a lot of people expected. And one of the things that utilities, policymakers, legislators, everyone has to look at is what is the need for that centralized grid, that centralized power system? And are we actually structuring it the right way? Are we, right now, I said that I have solar on my roof. On an average year, I will produce about the same amount of energy as I need. What should be the appropriate fee for me to connect into the grid? And a lot of times the debate is around, well, I shouldn't have to pay to connect to the grid. Well, I think that's a debate that's worth having. And as you look across the country, those debates are starting to happen. I'm sure you're seeing it firsthand.
Well, no, and it's the same discussion. I mean, we all pay to connect to our cable TV provider. We all pay to connect to our cell phone provider. Yeah. So this goes back to net metering.
We're not selling anything back to the cable TV.
No, but every month I have to give a connection fee. I have to pay whatever, $5, right? But so, and by the way, so what's interesting with net metering is that it has been an incredible program or policy to goose the solar market. and it's really worked. Our argument is it will only work, continue to work, if there's what we would call net metering reform. It has to work for the consumer, for the installer, and for the utility. That's how it's worked so well before. And so if that gets kicked around, if that gets out of sync, then we need to reform it.
Well, I'd just like to get this one question asked, and that is, who is going to pay when the prime customer is self-generating? Who is going to pay for the wires and transformers and poles for the person who lives in a small apartment, for the person who doesn't have the option of solar, and who needs electricity just as much as anyone else?
So if you think about history, though, Thomas Edison created the first utility 100 years ago, and he made it a monopoly. He actually wanted it to be wireless energy. He assumed it would all just be wireless. And he couldn't do it, so he put up poles and wires.
Well, and today a man called Tesla actually thought he could do it.
Good point, exactly.
And then he died with these plans, and we never learned whether it could happen or not. But it's actually beginning to happen with charging cars, with induction.
Well, it very much is. And actually Google is actually the most utilities across the country are probably worried about Google as a competitor.
We're getting ahead of ourselves before we get Google in here. There is a revolution going on. I just want to know who's going to get hurt and who's going to win. Let us look at the winners. Let's go to the winners. What are going to be the rewards of this new disruptive technology? And it's not just solar. Other things will happen. You've got to charge your electric car. That's a new customer. It's a customer when utilities want them. It's a customer in the night, presumably, or primarily.
It's a lot of customers.
You're getting more charging stations, and electric cars are not new. Do you know that Harrods, the great London department store, used electric vehicles, driven electric vehicles, not like milk floats, from 1924 until well into the 1960s, I think the 70s. But they were very slow, and they had to be constantly charged. There were all these lead-acid batteries, and it wasn't ideal. But now we've got new, better batteries, and everything changes. Who are going to be the winners? Maybe there'll be enough cars to make the electric utility the winner. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, so that question can be answered so many different ways. I think ultimately consumers are going to be the winners. Because one of the things that we haven't touched on is, as an industry, we haven't really given consumers very much choice over the years. Right, as you did in your introduction,
it's a vanilla commodity.
Right, flick the switch and it works. Right, and so there's a benefit to that. What we're seeing with microgrids, smart grid, solar with batteries, electric vehicles that can turn off and on when there's peak times, I think ultimately that will create a much more efficient network, an efficient grid, and then consumers ultimately will be the winners. Because what a lot of consumers don't understand is we overbuild the system, we engineer the system for those 30 or so days throughout the year where we have to have peak generation ready to go. And not to get into the minutia of how the energy market works, but if we could be much more efficient and much more stable with our use of energy, we could actually invest in a much more efficient way.
What is demand management?
Demand management, in its simple terms, is just managing the peaks, managing the ebbs and flows of energy. Because as we all know, during certain days, certain times of the day, we use much more energy. If we could use a lot of the computer technology and the infrastructure that's out there and helps power our homes and businesses in a much more integrated way, we can see a much more efficient or flat demand curve.
Brian, in constant dollars, 10 years out, is electricity going to be cheaper or more expensive?
Well, historically, it'll just be more expensive. But what I think we're going to see, and I think Ed's right, the consumer's going to win here. There will be other challenges and problems with whatever comes out. So, electric vehicles are not the panacea for the climate problem. It's simply going to create other different problems, but it may help mitigate some climate problem. It becomes an opportunity, but it doesn't mean problems go away. So what we'll start seeing is all of us, I think what you're really seeing is utilities and their customers are together saying, let's just be smarter about how we use our energy. Can we do that? And increasingly, we're seeing that. You're seeing it in electric vehicles. I mean, electric vehicles are fascinating to me. I have young kids, and we just got the Leaf, the electric vehicle. I think it's the coolest thing in the world. They're not impressed at all because we charge everything. They're like,
what's the range on it?
100 miles. So here's why it's good for us. It's a commuter car.
Yeah.
So my wife and I drive in and out from Arlington, Virginia to Washington, D.C. and then we drive around Arlington, Virginia to take the kids to sports or school.
But the state of the art now is about 250 miles.
Well, that's a Tesla, and that's a nice car.
That's a Tesla.
Yeah. But the Leaf is cool. I mean, we drive it to work, we come home, and just plug it in. And that's where the utility can really win, because here I am now charging this thing all night, where I wasn't before.
But interestingly enough, and
do you charge it off a regular plug, or do you have an accelerated
just
charger?
Just regular plug, so it takes 8 hours.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier EEI. Brought
Edison
in
Electric, the trade association of the electric industry.
Actually brought in the co-founder of Tesla. And what a lot of people don't realize is when they were building the Tesla, they weren't building it for the environmental reasons, the energy reasons. They were building a high-performance car that happened to be electric. Yeah. And I thought that was fascinating for industry executives to hear that. And now couple that with the ability to now use it as part of the grid optimization, I think you actually have a winning recipe there.
But tie into that recipe, you have, so Tesla with Elon Musk, he's also one of the investors in the largest solar company in the country called Solar City. You can today buy Solar City and get one of their old batteries in your basement to actually start charging and use it as backup power. And so battery
He's
power...
He's also building an enormous factory to build batteries, state-of-the-art batteries.
Yeah. But battery power for our homes is going to be fascinating.
What are the other technologies that are impacting?
So I think the biggest one, and we haven't touched on it at all, is LED lighting, right? So the new customers have gone from incandescent lights to the CFL lights that everyone would complain about, the lighting quality, to now LED lights, which I'm sure you're using here in the studio. And that technology is an absolute game changer. It uses a fraction of the energy, and consumer feedback has been absolutely amazing. I actually have some friends that were giving them away as stocking stuffers during the holiday season.
Really.
So you're a commercial company trying to make money and trying to reduce what you sell at the same time.
It's like big tobacco towers.
That's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, so here in the Northeast, we deregulated many years ago. So we at National Grid are a pipes and wires company. We don't make money on the commodity. And so that's oftentimes a conversation with our customers that we have to keep having. So we don't necessarily, it doesn't matter to us how much energy or how much gas flows through the pipe. To us, it's really the efficient use of energy and optimizing those assets and that infrastructure.
Brian, one thing I want to put up on the screen, we'll get it, a copy of your book on this whole subject. I think that... what's the book called?
It's called Green is Good.
Oh, that's what I say about nuclear.
Well,
green is good.
They do say that too.
Big
exactly.
green.
Exactly.
And I want to know where Google fits into all of this.
Well, so Google is fascinating that they're doing a lot of experimentation on energy, and the assumption is that they actually have the ability to become their own utility. And hear me out, because what they're doing is they're buying huge amounts of land, Iceland and all over Europe, where they can get geothermal power. Now, geothermal power is consistent, constant power. It's cheap power. It's great power, clean power. And
there is, Brian, there is a problem. There's no free lunch.
Well, I agree. Oh, no, I totally agree. But the argument now is they're building it for their data centers, their data hotels.
Yeah.
But the assumption is that what they're really doing is creating a utility, and that they will create wireless energy. And wireless energy that they can then take from the ground, satellite up, and it will then charge my Google phone or my Google car or my Google whatever.
Wow.
And
I have to pull the plug on this one. We are out of time. Thank you both for a fascinating discussion. It's Brian Keane of SmartPower and the author of the book, which you see on the screen, and Edward White, who is the Vice President of Customer Strategy and Environmental at National Grid. Thank you both. We'll be back next week. Until then, keep the lights on. Cheers.